What if the most persistent royal mystery of the last decade wasn't hidden behind palace walls, but buried inside a birth date the world never thought to question? Because for years a quiet rumor floated at the edges of public conversation, dismissed as bitterness, waved away as family drama, laughed off as tabloid noise, and yet it never fully disappeared. It lingered like a shadow behind every polished photo and perfectly worded press release. The idea that something about Meghan Markle's personal timeline simply didn't add up, and while millions accepted the official version without blinking, a small group of critics, skeptics, and estranged family members kept circling back to the same uncomfortable question, not shouted, not proven, just whispered over and over again. What if the numbers were wrong? What if the age the world was told wasn't the age that existed before the spotlight arrived? And what if the story everyone believed was not a lie outright, but an edit? Because edits are easier to defend than fabrications, and edits are how images survive under pressure. Long before royal titles and Netflix cameras, Meghan Markle existed as a private person with a past known mostly to those who shared her childhood, and among them was her half-sister Samantha Markle, a figure widely criticized, often dismissed, and routinely framed as unreliable. Yet Samantha's claims were never about fame or envy, at least not at her telling. They were about arithmetic, about memories that didn't match press biographies, about birthdays that felt out of place, about a timeline. That shifted depending on who was telling the story, and when Samantha first suggested that Meghan might be older than publicly stated, the response was swift and brutal. She was labeled jealous, unstable, bitter, irrelevant, and the conversation ended before it ever really began. But rumors have a strange habit of surviving ridicule, especially when time keeps dragging them back into view. Observers began noticing small things, nothing definitive, just inconsistencies that made people pause. Interviews where ages didn't align with anecdotes, old school references that seemed off by a year or two, photos that looked older than they should have been. And while none of this proved anything, it fed a growing sense that the public narrative was unusually polished, unusually controlled, as if every detail had been sanded smooth for presentation. Authors like Tom Bauer would later remark, in commentary that fueled online debate, that many early warnings from family members had been mocked only to later echo events that did, in fact, unfold. And while that didn't validate every claim, it reopened the door to questions people had been told not to ask. Critics began framing it differently, not as an accusation, but as a mystery, because mysteries are safer than declarations, and this one centered on math, not motive. Meghan's official birth year places her at the center of a neat, linear story, a young woman navigating Hollywood, finding love, entering royalty at precisely the right age for the fairy tale to work. But alternative interpretations, discussed quietly in online forums and commentary channels, proposed an earlier birth year, which, if true, would subtly but significantly shift how certain milestones are perceived. And suddenly age wasn't vanity. It was context. Old family recollections resurfaced. Stories of the baby sister that didn't feel quite as young as advertised. Memories of teenage milestones that seemed advanced for the official age. And while memory is imperfect, patterns caught attention. Thomas Markle, Meghan's father, would later say in interviews that certain dates in official biographies didn't align with what he remembered as a parent, not in a dramatic way, but in the practical, mundane way fathers remember. The age at first job, first car, school transitions, moments anchored to years rather than feelings, and critics argued that while one memory can be faulty, multiple overlapping ones raise eyebrows. Still, none of this would have escaped niche discussion if not for one artifact that online investigators point to again and again, a printed magazine feature from the 1990s, long before royal PR machines existed, which appeared to list Meghan Markle with an age that didn't align with the official birth year. And this single piece of print media became the centerpiece of speculation, not because it was definitive, but because print feels permanent in a way digital content does not. Defenders argue it could have been a mistake, a misprint, another person with the same name, and those explanations are plausible, but skeptics counter that the coincidence feels too precise. The name, the location, the timing, and suddenly what had once been dismissed as family resentment transformed into an unresolved question mark. Two timelines began to coexist in public discussion. one endorsed by official records and institutions, and another stitched together by critics using anecdotes, printed material, and perceived inconsistencies, and neither side could conclusively erase the other. The debate intensified not because of proof, but because of silence, because Meghan herself has rarely addressed such claims directly, which supporters say is dignified restraint, and critics interpret as strategic avoidance, and in the absence of clarification, speculation filled the gap. Age, however, was only the entry point, because once people began questioning one detail, they began re-examining others, especially moments that were already wrapped in privacy, such as pregnancies, births, and medical timelines, areas where public information is limited by design. Observers pointed to Prince Harry's own memoir, not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as a source of confusion, noting that his description of hospital procedures and timelines did not align neatly with standard medical protocols as understood by professionals who commented publicly. And while memoirs are personal recollections rather than medical records, the discrepancies fueled further debate. Critics argued that the narrative sounded cinematic, emotionally resonant, but logistically compressed, while supporters countered that royal births followed different rules, different resources, different considerations, and both arguments found audiences ready to believe them. What made the discussion persist wasn't any single claim, but the accumulation of unanswered questions: why certain details were emphasized while others remained vague, why some timelines were precise down to the minute while others were blurred entirely, why critics felt stonewalled and supporters felt protective, and why a story that should have settled years ago continued to resurface with renewed intensity. In the world of modern celebrity, image management is not deception, it's survival, and many analysts argue that what we are witnessing isn't a scandal, but a clash between private reality and public branding, a collision point where human history meets curated mythology. Meghan Markle's rise from actress to duchess required a narrative that worked globally, instantly and flawlessly, and in that process, edges were softened, complexities removed, and contradictions minimized, not necessarily to mislead, but to simplify, and simplification, critics argue, is where truth sometimes gets lost. Whether the age controversy is rooted in error, misunderstanding, or intentional revision remains unproven, but the reason it captivates audiences is because it symbolizes something larger, the fear that in an era of constant storytelling, even basic facts can become flexible when the stakes are high enough. Samantha Markle's role in this story remains polarizing. To some, she is a cautionary tale of family conflict magnified by fame, to others a voice that refused to be silenced, and to most, a reminder that every polished public figure leaves behind people who remember them before the polish. This isn't about proving anyone right or wrong. It's about understanding how narratives are built, defended, and challenged, and why once doubt enters the conversation, it rarely leaves. Because when you start pulling at one loose thread, age, timeline, memory, or motive, you don't just unravel a fact, you unravel trust, and trust, once questioned, changes how every story is heard thereafter, and maybe that's why this debate refuses to die. Not because people want a scandal, but because they want certainty in a world increasingly built on edits. And as more archived material resurfaces, more interviews are rewatched, and more timelines are reconstructed frame by frame, the question remains suspended in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore. Is this simply the noise of fame colliding with family fracture? Or is it a reminder that behind every immaculate public image, there may always be an earlier draft the world was never meant to read? What makes this controversy linger isn't just the claims themselves, it's the way every attempt to dismiss them seems to generate even more curiosity, because in the modern media ecosystem, silence doesn't kill a story, it fertilizes it, and the more Meghan Markle's official narrative remained pristine and untouched, the more critics leaned in, dissecting not just what was said, but what was carefully left unsaid. And that's where the discussion shifted from age to architecture. The architecture of a public identity that appeared almost surgically refined. Commentators began pointing out that Meghan's story, from childhood to Hollywood to royalty, unfolds with an almost cinematic smoothness. No awkward gaps, no detours, no visible trial and error. A progression so linear it felt authored rather than lived. And while supporters praised that as resilience and reinvention, skeptics saw something else, an edited timeline built for mass consumption. In Hollywood, altering age is not scandalous, it's routine, casting decisions are ruthless, and careers often depend on perception rather than precision, and many analysts suggested that if any age discrepancies existed at all, they likely originated there, not in malice, but in survival, a subtle adjustment that later hardened into official fact once fame locked it in place. But what complicated that theory was the transition from Hollywood branding to royal record, because once a narrative enters institutional space, it's no longer flexible, it becomes archival, and critics argue that any early adjustment would have required consistent reinforcement thereafter, which might explain the relentless control over biographical details. This is where the conversation took a sharper turn, because once critics framed the issue not as deceit, but as momentum, the idea that a small edit snowballed into an unchangeable truth, the story became disturbingly plausible. People began rewatching old interviews with new eyes, noticing moments where Meghan described her youth in ways that felt emotionally authentic but temporally vague, anecdotes without dates, memories without anchors, stories that floated rather than landed, and while that alone proves nothing, it fed the growing perception of deliberate ambiguity. Even birthday celebrations, normally harmless social rituals, became fodder for analysis. The language used, the framing of milestones, the way age was acknowledged but rarely contextualized, and critics wondered why something so simple appeared so carefully handled. Meanwhile, Samantha Markle continued to loom over the discourse like a ghost the narrative couldn't fully exorcise, because every attempt to discredit her paradoxically amplified her, and while many dismissed her as unreliable, others pointed out that her claims had remained oddly consistent over time, not evolving, not escalating, just repeating the same core assertion. The math doesn't work. That consistency, more than her credibility, is what kept people listening. And then there was Thomas Markle, whose involvement shifted the emotional texture of the debate, because unlike Samantha, he wasn't speaking as a rival or critic, but as a parent grappling with a public version of his daughter he barely recognized, and his comments weren't explosive. They were quiet, almost confused, which made them harder to dismiss outright. He spoke about dates and years not with certainty, but with discomfort, as if trying to reconcile two overlapping memories that refused to align, and critics argued that while parents can misremember, they rarely forget entire phases of a child's development, especially when those phases involved concrete responsibilities like work, schooling, or transportation. This wasn't about catching someone in a lie, skeptics insisted. It was about acknowledging that something felt off, and feeling off is often where investigations begin. The internet, as it always does, filled in the gaps, reconstructing timelines, comparing archival material, scanning yearbooks, cross-referencing magazine features, and while much of this bordered on obsession, it also revealed how little primary documentation the public actually had access to, and how heavily the official story relied on repetition rather than verification. Defenders argued that none of this mattered, that age speculation was misogynistic, invasive, and irrelevant, and that Meghan owed the public nothing beyond what she chose to share, a position many agreed with. Yet, even among supporters, there was an acknowledgement that the controversy persisted because it intersected with broader themes of authenticity, trust, and image-making in the digital age. This wasn't just about Meghan Markle anymore. It was about whether public figures can ever fully escape their pre-fame selves, or whether those earlier drafts inevitably resurface once the spotlight becomes permanent. The debate deepened when critics began linking age speculation to other tightly controlled aspects of Meghan's public life, particularly her approach to privacy, which some viewed as principled and others as selective, and it was in that gray area that suspicion thrived. Why share certain intimate details while sealing others completely? Why invite cameras into some moments while fiercely guarding others that historically had been documented in royal tradition? Supporters said boundaries, critics said choreography, and neither side could conclusively win. The narrative tension escalated because every explanation seemed to generate another question, another inconsistency, another moment that could be interpreted two entirely different ways depending on the lens applied. And perhaps the most unsettling realization for observers wasn't that Meghan might be older than stated, but that if such a basic detail could become contested at all, it revealed how fragile public truth has become, how easily consensus can fracture when narratives are curated rather than corroborated. In that sense, the age debate functions less like an accusation and more like a stress test, exposing the fault lines between memory and media, family and fame, private history and public myth. Because once the idea takes hold that a story has been polished beyond recognition, every detail becomes suspect, not because it's false, but because it feels managed. And management, by its nature, implies intention. As critics continue to pull at these threads, they began asking a more unsettling question, not about when Meghan was born, but about who gets to decide which version of a life becomes official, the person who lived it, the institution that benefits from it, or the audience that consumes it. And that question set the stage for the most volatile phase of the debate yet, because once age was linked to credibility and credibility linked to motherhood, the scrutiny shifted into territory far more explosive than dates on a page, territory that would ignite global arguments, divide audiences completely, and ensure that this controversy would never again be dismissed as just family drama. By the time the discussion drifted from age into motherhood, the temperature of the conversation changed completely because age speculation might bruise an image, but anything involving children, pregnancy, and birth detonates emotions instantly, and critics knew it, supporters felt it, and the internet responded accordingly. This was the moment when the debate stopped being niche and turned radioactive, not because of any single allegation, but because of how fiercely controlled the narrative around Meghan's pregnancies had been from the very beginning. Observers began pointing out that while royal births are traditionally public in conformation, if not in spectacle, Meghan's approach emphasized privacy to an unprecedented degree, which defenders applauded as modern and protective, while skeptics interpreted it as unusually restrictive. And once again, the same facts supported two entirely different interpretations. The more privacy was asserted, the more curiosity intensified, because secrecy in the age of oversharing is never neutral. It's a statement, and critics began asking why certain medical details that had been casually shared by previous royals were now completely off limits, even in basic form. These questions didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were fueled by Prince Harry's own recollections, which, while heartfelt, struck many readers as oddly cinematic, rich in atmosphere but thin on logistics, and it was the logistics that became the focal point. Medical professionals commenting generally, not about Meghan specifically but about standard procedure, explained that childbirth, particularly in well-documented hospital environments, follows protocols that don't bend easily. And when readers compared those protocols to the timeline described in the memoir, they noticed gaps, compressions, and sequences that felt more symbolic than procedural. Supporters argued that memoirs are not medical charts, that memory reshapes experience, and that royal arrangements likely differ from standard cases. All reasonable points, yet the unease remained because the inconsistencies weren't emotional, they were chronological. The conversation sharpened further when analysts began mapping timelines minute by minute, not claiming deception, but questioning plausibility and asking whether the narrative had been streamlined for storytelling rather than accuracy. That distinction mattered, because storytelling edits don't imply wrongdoing, but they do imply curation, and curation invites scrutiny. As these debates spread, they collided with the earlier age controversy in an unsettling way, because age changes how people interpret pregnancy narratives, and suddenly two separate discussions merged into one volatile question. If the timeline is wrong in one place, could it be wrong in another? Critics stressed that this wasn't about accusing anyone of impossibility, but about acknowledging that certain versions of events appeared almost too smooth, too effortless, especially when compared to the lived experiences of millions of women whose pregnancies involved complications, recovery, and visible strain. Meanwhile, supporters pushed back hard, calling the speculation invasive, cruel, and rooted in misogyny, arguing that women are not obligated to perform suffering publicly to validate their experiences, and that medical realities vary widely, a counterpoint that resonated deeply with many viewers. And yet, even within that defense, there was an undercurrent of frustration that the questions would not stop, that the narrative, no matter how carefully defended, kept attracting doubt. Online forums filled with side-by-side comparisons, past royal precedents, expert commentary stripped of personal reference, and endless disclaimers, and still the tension refused to resolve. The debate reached another inflection point when people began noticing how rarely Meghan herself addressed pregnancy specifics directly, choosing instead to speak broadly about motherhood, identity, and emotional transformation, which supporters saw as grace and critics saw as avoidance. And again, interpretation depended entirely on perspective. What kept the controversy alive wasn't accusation. It was asymmetry. The feeling that some details were hyper-controlled while others were left intentionally vague. And vagueness, when paired with earlier timeline questions, feels loaded even when it isn't. As more people re-examined public footage, interviews, and photographs, analysts cautioned against confirmation bias, reminding audiences that images freeze moments out of context, and that bodies, especially pregnant bodies, don't conform to expectations. Yet the scrutiny continued because once suspicion enters a narrative, every frame becomes evidence, whether it deserves to be or not. This is where the debate became self-sustaining, because the act of defending against speculation often produced more material for speculation, and every clarification raised another why, another how, another what if. In the background of all this noise was a deeper cultural discomfort, the realization that modern celebrity narratives are less about documentation and more about messaging, less about record and more about resonance, and Meghan Markle, willingly or not, had become the embodiment of that shift. Her story, intensely managed, emotionally powerful, and fiercely defended, functioned like a mirror reflecting public anxiety about authenticity in an era of branding. And as critics and supporters locked into opposing camps, the original question about age began to feel almost irrelevant, because something much larger had surfaced: the question of whether any public figure's story can remain untouched once it becomes symbolic. The more Meghan's narrative was framed as empowerment and reinvention, the more some observers insisted on pulling it apart, not to destroy it, but to understand its construction. And that impulse, whether fair or not, ensured that every private choice would be reinterpreted as strategy, every silence as intent, every inconsistency as potential revelation. By this point, the controversy had outgrown the individuals involved and become a referendum on truth itself, on whether official records outweigh lived memory, whether institutions trump families, whether polish invalidates humanity, and whether the public is entitled to coherence from people whose lives have become cultural property. And just as the debate threatened to exhaust itself, something else reignited it entirely, not a new claim, but a resurfaced artifact, an old piece of print media that critics said predated all image control, all royal machinery, and all modern narrative management. And once that artifact re-entered the conversation, the age question snapped back into focus with renewed force, because unlike memories or interviews, ink does not forget, and when two timelines are printed on the same page, only one can survive.